Okay, everybody, it's time for another one of my world-famous tier lists. This time, we're going to take a trip down memory lane and we'll ask the question, what is the best decade for music? Now, personally, I think I'm going to go with the 1650s because I'm a big fan of Baroque, and the 1650s were an absolutely, just the Baroque of that decade was absolute fire. Personally, but for the sake of this channel, we're going to skip through the 1650s and 60s and 70s. We're going to skip all the way ahead to what I consider to be the first decade of modern music, which is the 1980s. So let's start there. Let's talk about the 1980s. We'll go through in order, and then we'll rank each decade on a tier. Yeah, overall music. So we're going to look at this. We're going to look at all of it. We'll look at metal, rap, punk, pop. We'll look at all of it. But I'm going to play a metal video in the background here because I know that you guys like metal and I want to hold your attention. So all of the videos that you see here will feature metal artists so that you, to give you the dopamine hit of mentioning the band that you like, well, I talk about things that aren't necessarily metal. But I will say that when it comes to metal, this is when metal, to me, starts actually getting good. To me, the metal of the 70s, if you can really even call it metal, to me, in my personal opinion, it's a little bit rough around the edges. This is also the year when rap started, but I gotta say, I know this is gonna make some people upset, but I don't think that 80s rap is very good, right? Like, I don't think Run DMC is good. Can anyone really say that you would choose to listen to this? Run DMC is good? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. So I will say, I think the metal of the 80s was pretty damn good because this is when we got, Slayer, Anthrax, Metallica, the beginnings of death metal, stuff like Napalm Death started going on. So I think it was a great year for metal, or a great decade for metal, rather. In my personal opinion, 70s punk was kind of laying the foundation for the 80s, which is when punk got actually good, right? Like a lot of the bands you would think of, like Dead Kennedys, Misfits, Black Flag, Descendants, a lot of those bands technically started in like the late 70s, but really kind of came into their prime in the 80s. So I would say the 80s was probably the best year, the best decade for punk, in my personal opinion. Metal was definitely good in the 80s. Thrash metal in particular was pretty awesome. Hair metal, obviously corny, and I feel like people now are starting to appreciate hair metal much more than they did, for a long time. For a long time, it was just completely unforgivable to like hair metal, and I think people are now starting to appreciate it a little bit. Would I choose to listen to hair metal now? Probably not, but better than people thought it was at the time. So I would say, metal-wise, metal in the 80s was good. Maybe very good, but I think there was more to come. Punk was probably at its peak in the 80s. Rap, not so good in the 80s. On the pop side of things, there was some pretty good stuff. Some classic stuff that you'll still hear now. Like, probably the biggest female pop star of the decade, I would say, is Madonna. Of course, you also had Janet Jackson, Michael Jackson, all the, kind of classic 80s pop stuff. New wave stuff, there's The Cure and Depeche Mode and the Smiths and all that kind of stuff. Not so bad. 80s had a lot of great one-hit wonders, it's true. But would you choose to listen to 80s music now? I don't think you would. I think you might listen to it like at your, holiday Christmas party, or maybe if you're really old, you might go to an 80s night. But I don't think that you would necessarily choose to listen to Madonna in the current year, right? Like, these are good songs that you remember and may have fond memories of them, but they're kind of like, you listen to them in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, right? You don't necessarily appreciate 80s pop songs, non-ironically. So what I would say, overall, the 80s to me is the first time where music really starts to get listenable. 60s music, 50s, like all that stuff, for me personally, is just too dated. I just can't do it. It's too dated. That's sort of my take on the 80s in general, is that it's really the first time that music, to me, starts to become kind of listenable, something that I would choose to listen to in the current day. But 80s is probably the most referenced decade of modern music, like The Weeknd, etc. No, that's totally true. However, I think that people like The Weeknd have done it in a way that's no longer corny. And that's the real issue to me with 80s music, is that most of it is kind of corny. I do like it, but overall, relative to the other decades, I'm going to say the 1980s, where do you guys think the 80s belong? Yeah, I think a B tier is fair. Definitely not the best decade of music, but definitely not the worst either. I'm going to go with a B tier. Good, but not amazing. But you know what? For the sake of completeness, let's fill this out. I'll say that the 1970s, to me, is bad. Can't do the 70s. 70s music, probably the weakest. 60s, better. I would put the music of the 1950s, put them on the C tier as well. But the 70s had Led Zeppelin. Yeah, that's why it's in the F tier. 50s carries on solely as Christmas music. That's true. You know what? Just for the sake of the Christmas music, we can move it up to the B tier. Fair enough. But that brings us to the next decade that we want to look at, the 1990s. Now, I may be biased here. In fact, I'm biased because the 1990s were my teenage years. I was in high school in the 90s. I graduated in 96. So obviously the 90s, I'm biased. But I legitimately think the 90s were actually a really special decade for music because, in my opinion, the 90s is when modern music sort of began to exist, right? Because like in the 80s, things were still kind of contrived, right? Everything was controlled by sort of the old school, like major label system that decided who the stars were and, you know, wrote the songs for them and just said, here, get up there and play the thing, you know, all that kind of stuff. And of course, there were things in the 70s and 80s like, you know, indie rock and college rock and punk and stuff like that were sort of starting to challenge that. But the 90s, I think, is when things started to feel kind of real. And not just in terms of music, I would say in terms of movies too. Like if you look at a movie like Seven or Natural Born Killers or Pulp Fiction or, you know, stuff like that, like a lot of stuff from the 90s still holds up today. And even though the 80s may be more directly referenced, you know, in terms of like emulating the sound, I think the 90s is when sort of the modern sensibility really started to develop. And so if you think about on the rock and metal side of things, obviously we had grunge, which in my opinion, I think grunge was like the most significant development in like modern pop culture, really. Like, I really do. I mean, I don't know if anyone else is old enough to remember it. What's interesting to me with a list like that is that it may depend on when you came of age to your point. High school in the 90s makes it S tier. Yeah, but I'm not really like that. I'm not like a nostalgic person. So I'd like to think that I'm making this list objectively. The 90s rebels against the manufactured music of the 80s. I think that's the only way you can look at it. Obviously, we had grunge, which really just changed everything. Nu metal, of course, started with Korn. They were the originators of the whole genre, which of course then gave us, you know, Limp Bizkit and Slipknot and that as well. All the nu metal bands got their start in the 90s and then really probably peaked in the 2000s. But I think of nu metal as a 90s thing. On the rap side of things, there was a similar kind of, I would say, cultural shift happening with rap, because rap in the 80s, you know, you had your, you know, Run DMC and stuff like that was kind of corny. Respect to them, but kind of corny. But then gangster rap comes along with Dr. Dre, and then everything gets like real and gritty and raw, just like it did on the rock side of things. Pearl Jam, Nirvana changed music and the culture shift. They totally did. Yeah, Wu-Tang, Nas, Biggie, Mobb Deep. I don't like any of that stuff. Personally, I think 90s rap is incredibly hard to listen to and dated and bad, in my personal opinion. And I know all the rock fans are going to get mad because rock fans are very attached to dad rap. And that's what this stuff is to me. Remember, I grew up with all this stuff. To me, this is dad rap. I wouldn't listen to it. But certainly, objectively speaking, it was very significant. But I'd say like metal might have peaked in the 90s. Like, there was just so much great metal coming out then. All the alternative metal stuff like Fear Factory and whatnot. Death metal was at its peak. All the Florida stuff, you know, coming out of Morrisound Studios was amazing. I think like metal was at its peak in the 90s. This is when rap started to get good, even though I wouldn't necessarily choose to listen to it as well. I think punk peaked in the 80s. But you had bands like Green Day and The Offspring and NoFX and stuff like that sort of, you know, reaching more of like mainstream success in the 90s. So that's pretty significant. You know, towards the tail end of the decade, that's when, you know, Blink sort of started to break out. The weak spot to me in the 90s is pop. I don't think 90s pop was great. You know, I was trying to think of like, what are the really memorable 90s pop songs? And there certainly are some, but I feel like rock was really kind of the standout of the 90s. A little bit weak on the pop side of things. The rap stuff, to me, I don't think it holds up. I know everyone's going to be upset with me about that, but I don't think 90s rap is great. So overall, I would say 90s were a damn good decade, though. Damn good. A lot of the stuff that was sort of cooking in the 80s came to fruition in the 90s in a superior form. So I'm going to put the 90s on the A tier. An excellent decade for music. Definitely some decent pop in the 90s. But when we look back in the 90s, pop is not what we think about. Britney, Christina, Backstreet Boys, yeah, but that stuff really kind of peaked in the 2000s, actually. I would associate that more with the 2000s. Which brings us to the next decade, which is the 2000s. So on the rock side of things, well, if grunge and nu metal planted the seed in the 90s, we harvested that seed with the glorious bounty of butt rock in the 2000s. Nickelback, Creed, Saliva, Crazy Town. You know, you go down the list. The rich cultural tapestry that is butt rock is the gift that keeps on giving. Also, I would say that on the metal side of things, this is when like modern metal started to become a thing. Like if you listen to 90s metal, I mean, there's a lot of great 90s metal. In my opinion, it may be the best decade overall for metal. But think about what happened in the 2000s. Metalcore and deathcore, two big ones, or the new wave of American heavy metal, which is part of that, you know, Killswitch, Lamb of God, God Forbid, all that kind of stuff, Chimera. But metalcore and deathcore, that's when they came out. I would argue that those like kind of changed everything, right? Like the metalcore stuff from the early 2000s is still really kind of the foundation of what we think of. Like if you listen to what's on Octane or whatever, it's still the foundation of that. So, and then deathcore, of course, was like probably the most extreme music that's ever gotten anywhere near mainstream popular, you know, with like Suicide Silence hitting the Billboard charts and stuff like that. Nu metal hitting its peak, Iowa hitting number 3 on Billboard with the Blast Beat, that kind of stuff. So I think there's some damn good 2000s metal. To me, maybe not quite as inventive and interesting and experimental as stuff of the 90s, but damn good. Now, let's talk about on the rap side of things. I've got a big soft spot for 2000s rap. This is when snap music started to become a thing. Soulja Boy, of course, but, you know, then people like Young Jock and D4L. This is when Southern rap really started to take over. Lil Jon, all the Swishahouse stuff in Houston, like Mike Jones and Paul Wall, all that kind of stuff. I don't know that I would necessarily choose to listen to a lot of the 2000s rap stuff, but I think it is a really significant cultural shift that the South took over, because ever since the 2000s, like before that it was New York and to a lesser extent LA, but the 2000s is when the South really took over hip hop, and they've dominated ever since. You know, all the stuff from Atlanta and Texas and Florida, ever since then, you know, it's been all about the South. And a lot of these songs, I don't know that I would necessarily choose to listen to them, but you know, I recognize that it was an important shift. On the alternative side of things, we had the rise of TRL pop punk and Mall Screamo. So Mall Screamo being My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, all that kind of stuff. TRL pop punk, obviously Blink, the Big Dogs, but also Sum 41, Newfound Glory, Good Charlotte, that kind of thing. This is true too. The 2000s was the last decade that music was cultural. Yeah, this was like the end of the monoculture, when everyone was watching the same movies and TV shows, listening to the same songs, reading the same magazines, when everyone was following the same things, because this is before social media came along and shattered the monoculture. On the pop side of things, a lot of really, really great pop in the 2000s. Obviously, you know, the peak of Britney Spears, Katy Perry, Pink, all that kind of stuff. Really, really, really strong pop songs. Lady Gaga, that's right, you know, in the later 2000s. A lot of really, 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 really great pop songs. I would say in terms of like pop punk and emo, I think the 2000s were the peak. Some damn good pop in the 2000s. Metal was very good, but I think maybe not quite as good as the 90s in my personal opinion. So, you know, I think it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Where would you guys put the 2000s? I'm going to go with the S tier. That's what I think. If I could only pick one decade of music to listen to, I think it would be the 2000s. There's great stuff from every decade, but if I could only pick one, I think I would choose the 2000s. That's what I think. Now, you see, all you people who accused me of being nostalgic and only rating the 90s highly because that's where I went to high school, you're wrong. I graduated from high school in 96, so I was an adult. I was in my 20s in the 2000s. I'm not a nostalgia guy. It's not me. Objectively speaking, I think the 2000s is superior. The 2000s master race, not to mention, this is the decade that gave us low-rise jeans, whale tail, skunk hair, Fox racing girls, just the peak of female performance in the 2000s. No question about that. Let's just take a moment to appreciate that. This right here. This is it. The peak of female performance right here. That's right. Then they threw it all away from mom jeans and hairy armpits. What happened? Where did we lose our way? Reject modernity, embrace tradition. Bring it back, people. Bring back the 2000s. Okay, well, that brings us to our next decade that we'll revisit here, which is the 2010s. To me, the 2010s are when things kind of start to get a little bit murky. This is the post-monoculture world. So, there's still some really big megastars here. But if you think about it, the people that we think about now as like the giant megastars in any genre or any form of entertainment, most of them got big in the 2000s and the 90s. The 2010s, yeah, we start getting more niche. Exactly. So on the metal side of things, I think this is like arguably the worst decade for metal, the 2010s. So this is when Gent is probably like the biggest kind of new thing, the 2010s. Ghost is probably the only real like breakout band I can think of from back then. And, deathcore and metalcore just became like just the most like insufferable, like Reddit dork shit. Can't handle it. I think this is like the absolute worst decade for metal. On the hip hop side of things, though, I think, in my personal opinion, this is the peak of hip hop. 2015 to 2019, in my personal opinion, the peak of rap. Future, Young Thug, Migos. To me, that's the absolute peak of it. When alternative kids took over rap. That's right. And then, of course, all the SoundCloud, emo rap stuff, Juice, Peep, X, all that kind of stuff. Ghostman, Suicide Boys, Travis Scott. Yeah, to me, this is just like the absolute peak of hip hop. And if I could only listen to one era of rap forever, for sure, it would be like the late, 2015 to 2019. 100%, no doubt, this is what I would choose to listen to. Oh, and of course, yeah, the Jake Paul song. That's right. Everyday Bro on that Disney Channel flow. For sure, the hit of the century. So definitely a low spot for metal. I would say a high spot for hip hop. In terms of punk, there really wasn't a lot going on with punk. Like, I feel like punk stopped being relevant, basically with the TRL era in the mid to late 2000s. Pretty much just completely fell off the map. The only thing you could really point to kind of in the world of punk would maybe be, like the sad boy, Tumblr, pop punk stuff, like The Story So Far, Knuckle Puck, Real Friends, stuff like that. But, none of that stuff was really all that significant. I mean, great bands. Yeah, Wonder Years, great bands, but just really, they didn't really do anything the way that the TRL bands did. So I'd say a pretty low point for punk as well. On the pop side of things, though, a lot of really cool stuff going on in pop. For sure, the biggest star of this era, of course, was Taylor Swift. But this is when Billie Eilish came out. Bad Guy, was like her big breakthrough in 2019, but I think she came out a little bit before that. So this is when like pop started getting kind of weird and alternative. But there's also like Ed Sheeran sort of had his, peak then, the 1975. I think there was a lot of really, really, really good pop in the 2010s. So overall, yeah, Lorde, Demi Lovato, that's right. Alternative kids took over in the 2010s like they did in the early 90s. That's exactly what happens. And Charlie XCX, that's right. I would consider the 2010s to be the peak of sort of artsy pop. There's some cool stuff happening now. The 2000s maybe had the most catchy sort of like brain dead bubblegum pop, but I think the 2010s had the most artfully crafted, intelligent pop. So a real high watermark for the genre of pop. Overall, I think the 2010s, a damn good decade for music. And where do we put them? To me, it's a toss-up between the A or the S tier for the 2010s. But I think because rock was just overall in such a bad place, it's hard for me to put it on the A tier because it's just there's not a lot to work with in terms of rock. Certainly not in terms of metal. You put it on the B tier even. No, I'm going to put it on the A tier because the pop and hip hop were so good. Just the rock is not good. So I'm going to go with the A tier. That's what I think. Which brings us to the last decade, which is the 2020s. I got to say, I don't think, we're trending down. I do not think that the 2020s have been a great decade for music so far. We'll see. I'm open to changing my mind. On the metal side of things, the coolest thing for sure has been the breakthrough of all the TikTok bands like Lorna Shore, Slaughter to Prevail, Bad Omens, Sleep Token, stuff like that. The TikTok deathcore and baddiecore bands, that's been cool to see. Deftones, yeah, I mean, that's the sad part is, a band from 30 years ago is popular now because the rock that's coming out now is so crappy that people have to go back to fucking Deftones. Yeah, this is the nostalgia decade. That's what it is. I feel like this decade is all just people, looking back to the 90s and the 2000s. It just, to me, it just says that rock is out of ideas. Overall, I think, rock and metal is kind of shot at this point. And to be honest, I kind of feel the same about most other genres as well. On the rap side of things, starting around 2019, I think, when Roddy Ricch kind of blew up. After that, everyone started doing that like melodic trap stuff, the Young Thug type of melodic trap that I just don't really think is good at all. It all sounds the same to me. I think it's really boring. And then drill, to me, like, this is the era in which rap became more about the lore than the artists themselves. And I just don't think it's good music. I don't care about, the lore. Pop, also, it's like, this is the decade of what I would call vibe music. Nobody's really writing hooky songs anymore. It's just sort of like a lot of droning, boring music that to me it's not very interesting to me. And punk is just completely out of gas. There's nothing, there was like a very, very small kind of moment where it seemed like pop punk might be coming back, in 2020 and 2021 when MGK, had his #1 albums and Travis Barker was producing all that stuff. But that whole TikTok pop punk revival totally fizzled. There's nothing there. All that stuff's over. So I would say overall the 2020s rather have been a pretty crappy, disappointing decade for music. There's definitely some good stuff to listen to, but it's certainly not the decade that I would sort of choose to listen to. So I'm going to put it here on the B tier with the 80s and the 50s. That's what I think. I'd certainly rather listen to modern music than the stuff from the 60s or the 70s, but that's what I think on the B tier. That's what you think it could be C tier. Well, I would rather listen to 2020s music than I would 80s music. So I don't think that I could put it any lower than that. That's true. We do still have 7 years of the 2020s. It's true. There's still 7 years for me to be wrong. Totally true. For music to change course, there's still time for us to turn the ship around, people. Still time. Don't give up hope. But as for now, yeah, B, C tier, that's what I think. So there we go. We have our answer, people. The 2000s, the best decade of music. It is clear. It's the 2000s. Case closed. I'm hitting my gavel now. I rest my case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, order in the court, order in the court. A decision has been reached. The 2000s, the best decade of music. I rest my case. The rich cultural tapestry that is butt rock is the gift that keeps on giving.